como decían antes, de diciembre para coger ideas, para mejorar y sinceramente creo más que nunca que somos un gremio que se merece un respeto y un hueco profesional. Sí. Voy a presentaros a Brad y como deferencia hacia él voy a cambiar al inglés. I'm going to switch to English.
Es un honor estar aquí presentando a Brad Schoenfield. Es quizá uno de los investigadores más conocidos dentro de la hipertrofia muscular. Es difícil encontrar a otros investigadores con más artículos, con los índices de impacto que tiene.
And that's critical if we want to reduce the distance between the science and the application, the laboratory and the gym. Another characteristic of Brad Schoenfield that I would like to point out is that he's very used to working out, and that's very important. So when you listen to Brad Schoenfield speaking about repetitions, training to failure, supersets, you have to realize that this guy knows the theory, of course, but he knows also the feelings of heavy lifting, and that's very, very important. Let me mention some of his achievements. Brad Schoenfield has, of course, the NSCA certification, CSCS, CSPS, and NSCA CPT, all of them with distinction. He's the assistant professor in exercise science and the director of the Human Performance Lab at Lehman College in New York. He's the assistant editor-in-chief in the journal NSCA Strength and Conditioning Journal. He's a member of the board of directors of the National Strength and Conditioning Association. He's a member of the editorial advisory board in the Journal of the International Society of Sports Nutrition. He was named as the Personal Trainer of the Year in 2011 at NSCA. He has been awarded this year with the Dwight Eisenhower Fitness Award. He's the author of 2 bestsellers in the field of sport training, the Max Muscle Plan and Science and Development of Muscle Hypertrophy, and he has a lot of papers. So I don't want to steal any longer from Brad Schoenfield. It's a real pleasure. Thank you very much, Brad, for coming. Ladies and gentlemen, Brad Schoenfield.
Thank you. Thank you so much, David, and thank you to the NSCA Spain, who's done a really great job in helping to spread the knowledge of strength and conditioning throughout Spain and actually throughout most of Europe as well. They are the best affiliate that we have at the NSCA, so really appreciate you bringing me out here, and it really is my honor to come and present for you guys. So I want to start off by saying that mi habla español muy poquito, pero yo soy. So I will be giving my speech in English today. Believe me, you don't want me giving it in Spanish. And I will try to speak lentamente so that those in the audience who understand English can understand me better, and also so that the translator hopefully can provide a better translation for you guys. It really is my distinct pleasure to not only speak to you today. First of all, I love Spain. I love the Spanish people. You guys are so warm and display so much hospitality. I just always love coming here. This is now my 3rd trip to Spain, and one of my favorite places to visit. But it's also my pleasure to speak about the topic that I'm going to speak about today, which is resistance training variables and their application to resistance training hypertrophy, induced hypertrophy. So, if you want to get big, you need to lift smart. It doesn't mean that I've certainly seen a lot of people who don't lift smart and they will get bigger, but if you want to maximize muscle growth, you need to lift smart. You need to take a more scientific approach. So I can take pretty much anyone who doesn't lift smart and get them more hypertrophy. They might be big to start with, but I can help them get even bigger. And certainly, if you are challenged, if you are someone who does not respond well to training, it becomes even more important, más importante, to train with a more scientific approach. Now the problem is that all too often training for hypertrophy in particular has been based upon what we call bro science. Do you guys know what bro science is? So to quote my good friend Alan Aragon, bro science is when people defer to the más grande person in the gym, the big dude in the gym, for advice over what we know to be true by science. So it's basically deferring to anecdote of someone who is big and jacked to what we have learned through evidence. And the problem with that is that the guy who is big and jacked, certainly he probably knows something about training, but a lot of it is his genetics and also his pharmacology, if you know what I mean. You know, I don't know how to translate that into Spanish, but so they can get big despite not potentially training smart. And also, just because that person got good results from his efforts doesn't mean that you would. A lot of times, certainly we know that genetics account for a huge percentage of your ultimate potential. And also the pharmacology is pretty important too. So this is a really interesting study that came out a couple years ago. They studied 127 competitive bodybuilders. And some of the things they found was that virtually all of them performed 3 to 6 sets per exercise. They, 2/3 performed anywhere between 7 to 12 repetitions per set. More than 2/3 rested between 61 and 120 seconds, so 1 to 2 minutes. And these are kind of the really interesting things to me. More than 2/3 trained their muscle only once per week. None worked the muscle more than twice a week. And this is the coolest thing, or the most interesting thing. Every one, 127 out of 127 bodybuilders trained with a split routine. None trained with a total body routine. So our job as researchers and scientists is to test, are bodybuilders doing what is optimal, or can we maybe make bodybuilders better in what they do through science? And that has been, by the way, my personal endeavor. My research focus is it's in enhancing body composition, so maximizing muscle growth as well as fat loss. And much of what I'm going to discuss today is from the research that we've done in my lab. I will cover some of the other, certainly there's been some other really terrific researchers that have been carrying out some studies. But we're really now getting to a point where we're able to have a good understanding of how to optimize training. We're still a long way from being there, from having optimal approaches, but we're much further ahead than we were just 5 years ago. And that to me is very exciting. So here are the things that I'm going to cover today from the variable standpoint. We're going to cover volume, load, frequency, tempo, and rest period. There are other variables as well. There's actions, muscle actions, eccentric versus concentric. There is training to failure. There is there's several other, there's exercise selection and several other variables that can be manipulated. Unfortunately, from a time standpoint, we only have roughly 90 minutes here today. I'm limited to these 5. So the first topic that I'm going to cover is volume. And simply stated, it's most often expressed as sets times reps. So if you multiply, let's say you do 3 sets of 10, your volume is 30 repetitions. But what might be a better way to go about understanding, or certainly when I say better, what might be more indicative of the true effort, the true work that's involved, is to look at volume load, which takes into account how much weight is lifted. And to give you, for instance, if you do 3 sets of 10, that's 30 reps, but you're going to be using, let's say, 75% of your 1 repetition max. If you're going to do 3 sets of 3, you're going to be doing 90% of your 1 repetition maximum. So your volume load, you're going to actually have even though it's only 9 reps with the low rep condition versus 30 reps for the moderate rep condition, the gap will close a little when you factor in how much weight is lifted. So it might be 9 reps versus 30 reps in an overall sets times reps, but in a weight, the total weight lifted will be less. There will be less of a gap there. Now, this is a topic that's always been of real interest to me. You guys who know Mike Mentzer is? Some of you probably know Mike Mentzer. He was probably the biggest proponent of what they call the HIT approach, high intensity training, which is the 1 set to failure. Basically, the philosophy is that if you do 1 all-out set where you train as hard as you can, you push, and that last rep goes to failure, that you only need to do 1 set per exercise. And that was, Mike had learned that from Ellington Darden, who learned that from Arthur Jones. And this has been a bodybuilding controversy that's existed for a long time. Many will say that a HIT approach is all you need, and most bodybuilders, as you see, do not subscribe to that approach. As we talked about in the survey, virtually all bodybuilders are training in a 3 to 6 sets per exercise. Well, there is compelling evidence that the bodybuilders are correct here, that the HIT approach is not optimal. And what we found that there's a clear dose-response relationship between training and hypertrophy. So a dose-response relationship means that as 1 goes up, as the dose goes up, so does the response. So when you keep increasing volume, you're going to get increases in hypertrophy. A colleague of mine, James Krieger, who I've collaborated with on many papers since his publication, back in 2010, he published a meta-analysis. So you guys familiar with what a meta-analysis is? I'll give you the short course because we're going to be talking about this a lot today. A meta-analysis is when you pool the results of all studies together. One of the problems with exercise research is that we deal with small sample sizes, meaning that there are not many people in a study. And the reason is because it's very time-consuming and costly to carry out that research. When I carry out a study and I have 30 people in my study, they're training 3 days a week for an hour, that's 90 man-hours of training that I have to have someone there for. That's a lot of man-hours. So what we do is when we can take all the studies that have been done on a particular topic and pool them together into one big study, we get much more power, statistical power, to see if there are any true differences. And what James did back in 2010, he did this meta-analysis, and he found that there was a 40% greater effect size for multiple sets versus single sets. Now, an effect size is a statistic that deals with the magnitude, how important the effect is. So it's not just looking at probability, it actually looks at whether there is it looks at the meaningfulness, the practical meaningfulness of the response. And there was a 40% greater response with the multiple set routine. The issue back then when he did this study was that there was only 8 studies that had actually looked at the topic of volume. So it still was not a very well-researched topic in training. You would think that we'd have all this data, and we really don't. One of the things that you realize when you start looking at the research is that we're still pretty much in the infancy of training research. So there's so much that we think we know, and we don't. And we are, as you will see, we're constantly, the body of knowledge now is becoming exponentially greater. One of the things when I came into this field, I was a personal trainer for many years before I became an educator. And now I'm like a kid in a candy store, because I always used to think as a trainer, well, why don't we know about this? Why don't we know about that? I'm now actually getting to research all the topics that I always wanted to know about. I can now say, hey, why don't we know about this? I'm going to carry out a study, a controlled study. And we are now, like I said, slowly getting to the point where we can make better evidence-based conclusions. So the research here was a little sketchy because of the lack of studies. Very recently, this was just published 2 months, I think, or so ago. I think it was in August. Anyway, we carried out a follow-up meta-analysis. And this really is current with the data. There are now 15 studies that we found. So there's roughly double the amount of studies that James had looked at. And what we looked at here, as opposed to James just looking at single sets versus multiple sets, here we're now looking at how many sets per week per muscle group is optimal. And that, to me, is a little more important than 1 set versus 3 sets, because if you do 2 days a week, 1 set versus 3 sets, that's 2 sets a week versus 6 sets a week. If you're doing, let's say, 2 sets 3 times a week versus 6 sets 3 times a week, now you're dealing with 3 sets versus 18 sets. So the number of sets per muscle per week is more indicative of true training volume. So we found 15 studies that met inclusion criteria. And what we found, this is really interesting, look at the dose response. We found that when you did less than 5 sets, so 4 sets or below, there was a gain of 5.4%. When you increased that to 5 to 9 sets per week, the gains went up to 6.6%. But take a look at this. When volume went up to 10 plus sets per week, the gain was almost 10%. So basically, you're having almost a double the increase, an extra almost 5% increase, going from less than 5 sets to 10 sets or more. Here's the problem. We were not able to find out above 10 sets. There wasn't enough evidence, enough research to say, well, is 15 sets better than 10 sets? Is 20 sets better than 10 sets? So we don't really know where the upper threshold exists. But one of the cool things that we found here was that the effects were strengthened when we looked at direct measures of hypertrophy. So there's different ways that we can measure hypertrophy. One of them is total body hypertrophy through DEXA. You know what DEXA, I assume you know what DEXA is, or bioelectrical impedance. The problem with these, they're not very sensitive to actual hypertrophy. They're going to take into account body water, will influence the gains, the lean gains. So what's a more accurate way to look at it is through direct measures such as MRI or ultrasound, where you can, like ultrasound, which I use, you can actually put a probe on the bicep and you can see the difference in thickness that was seen. And as we looked at these direct measures, we actually saw greater disparities. So the effects were strengthened with these direct measures. And this is how it looks in graphical form. So take a look at how this is what we call the dose response. You see how it goes from, as you increase the dose, you increase the response. This to me is a really important slide. So this is called a forest plot. Basically, it takes every study that we looked at and then shows the effect of the actual routine, the higher volume versus the lower volume. Here is the 0 line. Everything to the right shows greater effects for higher volumes. Everything to the left shows greater effects of lower volumes. So take a look here. 14 out of the 15 studies showed better effects for the higher volume. There was only this one study here. You can see it's just barely to the left of the 0 line. See this study here by Radielli? That's the only one that showed a better effect for the low volume. The chances of that happening, the probability that that happens by chance, is almost nothing. So that really strengthens our confidence that the higher volumes have a greater effect. And by the way, this study here was carried out in 70-year-old untrained women. So I would say that probably pushing them too hard would have a negative effect when we're dealing with a very elderly person. It's not surprising that seeing at least not a superior effect of multiple sets would be seen there. But here's an important point. So we say, all right, so 10 sets are better than 8 sets per muscle per week, and 8 sets are better than 5 sets. Does that mean that 15 sets are better than 10 sets, that 20 sets are better than 15 sets? Where do you keep going? How do we know how many sets to do? Well, we actually don't. And that's, again, part of the problem is that there is a lack of evidence, a lack of research. We'd love to think that the research is very clear on this, is that we can just keep seeing this and we can start to pinpoint what our optimal training is, but we can't. And there is a point where optimal volume will plateau. And even past that, we have this threshold that you're going to see a peak, and if you keep training, what's going to happen with higher volumes? Let's say you start doing 30 sets, 40 sets, 50 sets per day, or per week. 60 sets. There's going to be a point where not only are you not going to see better gains, but you're going to start to overtrain. And when we overtrain, we know there will be a negative response. So there is this plateau, and this is a threshold of training. That's called an inverted U response. And there is this inverted U response that we see. So the threshold exists. Where is that threshold? Well, that's anyone's guess. What one of my working theories is that there is a benefit to periodizing volume, where we would culminate in a period of functional overreaching. And what that means is that so let's say that we know a higher volume is better than a lower volume in general, but consistently training at very high volumes will push you to overtraining. So here's the working theory. If you push someone for a short period of time, let's say 4 weeks, at a very high volume, you will not get to a point you'll catch them before they overtrain. And then you, let's say, bring them back down. So let's say you might want to push them to 20 sets per muscle per week. You might start with 10 sets per muscle per week for 4 weeks. The next 4 weeks you do 15 sets per muscle per week. Then you do 20 sets per muscle per week for another 4 weeks. And then you bring them back down again. So I liken that to going to a cliff. So we take them to the edge of the cliff, but just before they go over, we pull them back. And that way you avoid the overtraining possibility while keeping them at this higher level. And again, can I provide any research to that? No, there is certainly none. But when we don't have research, we defer to logical reasoning. So that's what we call a hypothesis, a working hypothesis based upon available evidence. That's something that I will be looking to study over time. But certainly until we have that evidence, research can only provide us with guidelines. Until things are tested, we go with the best available evidence and then use our intuition. With respect to intensity of load can be expressed in a couple ways. Number one is through the percent of 1 RM, the percent of the total your maximal weight lifted. The problem with that is that there's considerable variability. So I carried out a study, which actually I'll detail shortly, but we looked at the leg press. And I did 70% 1 RM in the leg press versus 30% 1 RM. And we had 12 subjects in the study, and the range at 70% 1 RM, I'm sorry, 75% 1 RM. What do you think the range was of the number of repetitions that someone got with 75% 1 RM? If you look at the charts, it would tell you that 75% 1 RM equates to roughly a 10 RM. You can get 10 reps at 75% 1 RM. Well, that's nice on an average basis. The variance, the variability in the range was 7 reps in the lowest one and 21 reps in the highest responder. So we had this huge variability in the number of reps that can be achieved. And that's why a better application of the load is through a repetition range. Have you guys seen this slide? This is right out of the Essentials of Strength and Conditioning text, the NSCA Essentials. And this is kind of the gold standard, what we have gone by for what's called the strength endurance continuum, the repetition max continuum. At the low end, so the heavy load end, that's your strength range. So 1 to 5 reps roughly is going to maximize muscle strength. At the higher, see, she likes my talk, right? Yeah. So that's the next figure queen there. At the higher end of the rep max continuum, we have roughly 15 plus. That is for muscle endurance. And it's always been stated that for maximal strength, well, that's your mid-range. That's your moderate repetition range. It's the so-called hypertrophy zone. And I want to thank, by the way, David lended me his biceps there for the picture. Gracias. The thing when we measure muscle growth, generally, we're looking at the growth of the entire muscle. So how much is that muscle growing? But what we're not looking at is the individual fibers within that muscle. And this is another really interesting area of research. So we know that the 2 basic types of muscle fibers are type 1 fibers and type 2 fibers. The type 1 fibers are your endurance-oriented fibers, right? And this is hopefully basic knowledge for you guys. So your endurance fibers, they can go on for long periods of time, but they are not able to produce great amounts of force. Whereas your type 2 fibers, they are strength-related fibers. They can produce a lot of force, but they fatigue easily. And it's been shown that the growth of the fast-twitch fibers is more than the growth of the slow-twitch fibers. The type 2 fibers have greater growth than the type 1s. Recent regression analysis from our lab shows that it's about 30% greater. However, what we have to consider is that the majority of studies that have looked at the topic have used heavier loads. So they've used loads of 70% 1RM and above. Could that predispose or bias these studies towards benefiting the type 2 fibers? Could it be that if we used a lower load, a lighter weight, that you'd have a benefit to the type 1 fibers for hypertrophy? Well, let's take a look. So some basics about, and hopefully this is a review for most of you guys, but I think it's important to go over how the response of fiber types go when we're lifting. So basically the fiber type response to a lift follows what we call the size principle. And that says that the motor units, which are attached to the slow and fast twitch fibers, are recruited in a small to large fashion. So the smallest motor units are going to be recruited first. The smallest motor units are associated with the type 1 fibers. And then as we start to get heavier, we'll start to recruit those type 2 fibers. And these are recruited in an orderly fashion each time. And again, it's a very logical, size-oriented increase. And this is how it looks graphically. So we start off, when you see the low loads, you'll see that they have the very small motor units attached. And as we get heavier and heavier, the largest motor units are going to be recruited. The issue with this theory, and certainly we know that if you lift very heavy, you're going to recruit the largest motor units. And we do know that if let's say I lifted this for a couple times, I don't need the type 2 fibers to be active, right? There's no reason that the body would need to activate these large motor units. By the way, am I speaking too muy rápido? Am I good? What it discounts is the role of fatigue. So let's say I'm lifting a light weight. Let's say I'm lifting a 30 repetition max. The first couple of reps are going to be really easy, right? So you're going to do a 30 rep max, which is the maximal. At 30 reps, you will fail. Okay, the last rep at 30, boom, you can't do another. So the first couple of reps, the weight's very light. I'm going to have no problem lifting that, right? So what am I getting here? Well, your body does not need the high threshold motor units. That would be inefficient for the body to follow. It's going to use these small motor units. But as I start going, so let's say I get to 10. I'm starting to get a little heavier, but it's still pretty easy. I'm probably somewhere in here. I'm going more. Now I'm at 20. I'm probably somewhere in here now, right? You're going to start to have to recruit the higher threshold motor units to keep that set going. By the time I'm at 30, at least theoretically, you're going to need the higher and higher threshold motor units. So that's part of the theory. Whether that actually takes place has not been well studied. But it's also important, before we explore that a little further, to understand that it's not just recruitment. We can recruit. Right now, I recruited a fiber. I recruited muscle fibers to lift, right? Anytime you carry out a muscle action, you're going to recruit fibers. Will that cause an adaptation? Will that cause, if I just did that, is that going to cause any need for my muscle to hypertrophy? No, just because you recruit a fiber does not mean it will necessarily adapt. Adaptation is both a function of recruitment, because we can't adapt if it's not recruited, but you also have to keep that fiber stimulated for a sufficient period of time with high firing rates to bring about an adaptation. Basically, you need to challenge that fiber beyond its present capacity, and that is more than just a recruitment response. That comes down to what we call activation. So muscle activation is both a function of, there's more than this, but in a simplified terms, it is your recruitment plus your rate coding. Rate coding is the firing frequency, how rapidly the firing of those motor units takes place. And this is something that really had not been well studied. I wanted to see, well, is there really a difference in activation between low load training, so lightweight training, and higher rep training, and higher load training, heavier load training? So I mentioned this study earlier. This is where we looked at leg press, 75% 1RM versus 30% 1RM. By the way, 75% 1RM, the range of reps, like I said, was 7 to 21. For the 30% condition, what do you think? It was 20 reps for one person and 70 reps. For 72 reps was actually, so we had one guy who was an outlier who was just off the charts. But huge variation in the number of reps achieved at 30% 1RM. Well, what did we find? Look at how much greater the activation is in the heavier load condition. It goes from 35% all the way up for these are your quad muscles, quadriceps, so your vastus medialis, lateralis, and rectus femoris. And the hamstrings were just off the charts greater with the heavier load. They say a picture is worth 1,000 words. This is an actual slide, an actual strip from the EMG. So to the left is your 75% 1RM. That's your 75% 1RM. To the right is your 30% 1RM. Look at the amplitude. Look at how high these peaks are versus these. So you could see how much greater the activation is with the heavy versus the lighter loads. That's pretty powerful. So the curious guy I am, I said, all right, we saw that in the leg press. If 30% 1RM is, if 30% 1RM is way lower, what about if I went up to 50% 1RM? So, and what about in the upper body? So here I looked at the bench press, and we did 50% versus 80% 1RM. Well, the gap closed a lot now. So now the difference is, rather than 35% on up, was only 17% in the sternal head of the pecs. So as we start, as you see, as the weight starts to get heavier, the activation gap starts to close. A colleague of mine recently carried out a study looking at 90% versus 70% and showed no difference. So ultimately, their activation, when you probably were figuring at 60, 65%, is going to start to have no effect at that point. But activation does not tell us necessarily about long-term response. It gives us indications as to what might happen, but it does not necessarily tell us, are you going to grow more? Just because you're getting more activation, we can hypothesize that there'll be greater growth. But in order to see whether that's true, we actually have to study the condition and measure the growth. So that's what we did. So the first thing we did was to do another meta-analysis, and as you'll see, we've carried out a lot of these meta-analyses now to get this statistical power, and that again can drive future research. We looked at all studies that looked at 65% or 60% 1RM and above versus 50% 1RM and below. So heavy versus lighter load training. We found only 8 studies. There really had not been at the time. This was completed in 2013, and there has been a bunch of studies since then, which I'll talk about. But back then, only 8 studies. And there really was no differences between the growth in the heavy versus light load conditions. So interesting. We see that activation is much greater in the heavy load condition, but the actual growth, when we actually carry out a study and measure the growth, there's not that much difference. Now the problem here, one of the things that stuck out to me is that every one of these studies, all 8 of these studies, was carried out in untrained subjects. What's the problem with that? What's the problem when we look at hypertrophy in untrained subjects? Well, the first several weeks, 4 or 6 weeks, you're seeing mostly neural improvements. Most of the improvements in strength are not due to increased growth, they're due to greater coordination that you're getting through the exercises, right? So hypertrophy doesn't start to really happen that much till after 4 weeks or so. And thus, you're not really seeing a true effect. And more so, in untrained subjects, they're going to have different growth capacities than more trained subjects, right? As you start to get more and more well-trained, you start to get closer to your genetic ceiling. You get closer to the point where your body does not want to grow anymore. Your body will start to fight growth past a certain point. So you're going to have to use different strategies to continue to grow. And just by looking at these studies, we can say, all right, we know in people who are new to training, there might not be a difference. But we know that in people new to training, they can get bigger by doing cardio. You put them on a spin cycle, do a spin class for 8 weeks, and you'll see hypertrophy of their quads because they hadn't been doing anything. Simply doing something, right? Taking someone from a untrained state and then putting them through a condition where they're exercising now is going to start to increase their muscle growth. That doesn't happen in trained subjects. So when I saw this, I said, all right, I want to study, in which I did, well-trained subjects. And I was convinced that we would not see virtually any growth using these light loads. I said, all right, this is a newbie effect. And once we put the well-trained subjects on the program, they're not going to see growth. Well, We basically, we looked at 19 well-trained men. They trained either with roughly 10 reps per set versus 30 reps per set. Everything else was controlled. We did 3 sets of 7 different exercises, 3 days a week, total body routine. What did we find? No differences. Basically, the growth was almost exactly the same between the conditions. So well-trained subjects, even using what we would call light weights, as long as they are really pushing to muscle failure, are seeing large increases in growth, substantial. So both moderate and heavy loads do produce growth. And thus, when we look at that strength endurance continuum that we talked about, with that hypertrophy range, what we start to see is that hypertrophy can be acquired over a very large continuum. That many different repetition ranges, really from the lowest range to the highest range, actually can promote growth. But here's a real interesting aspect. There is emerging research showing that type 1 fibers respond better to low load training, and that type 2 fibers respond better to heavier load training. That would seem to indicate that by combining the rep ranges, you'll get even better growth, because by using the higher rep training, you'll be targeting your type 1 fibers, and by using the heavier load training, you'll be targeting your type 2 fibers. So this slide here is from a study that is now in review. So you guys have to promise you're not going to take any photos of it. I'm joking. You certainly can share. This is a really compelling slide showing that we did what's called a regression analysis of all studies that had looked at heavier versus lighter load training and the fiber type response. So what was the response of the type 1 fibers versus the type 2 fibers? Well, you can see, so type 1 is here, with light loads, you have your type 1, greater type 1 in light load, less in the heavy load, and vice versa. So you see this X pattern, which does show, or at least does suggest, that your heavy load is preferential to type 1 growth, type 2 growth, and your light load is preferential to type 1 growth. All right, next we'll talk about frequency of training. And generally when we think of frequency, we are thinking of how many sessions in a given time period, but usually per week, right? You might work out 6 days a week, and that should have a frequency of 6 days. But what is also very important, if not more important, is how many days a week you work a given muscle group. The frequency of muscle group training, right? You train a muscle 1 day a week, 2 days a week, 3 days a week. Remember at the beginning, we talked about how bodybuilders, generally, most of them are only training each muscle 1 day a week. Over 2/3 trained each muscle 1 day a week on the split routines. So there is a trade-off between volume and frequency. I can increase volume by doing a 3-hour workout. But what's the problem with that? Well, if you're going to train with any degree of effort and intensity, so you're not just doing a set and then talking for another 15 minutes to spread out that training, you're going to start to get mentally and physically fatigued after a given point. Could it be an hour, hour 15, an hour and a half, 90 minutes? You start to train have a long session, and the quality of your training will degrade. So really the theory is that by having more frequent sessions, shorter sessions, but more frequent, you can maximize training quality. So that's the volume frequency trade-off. And that's why we can look at either doing a total body routine or a split routine. As I mentioned, every bodybuilder works with a split routine. There's many different ways we can split routines. Generally, bodybuilders are doing what we call a bro split. You guys know what a bro split is? That's like chest day 1, shoulders day 2, arms day 3, legs day 4, and so on. But you can do an upper-lower split. That's actually my current routine now is like upper body Monday, lower body Tuesday rest, upper body, lower body, where you're splitting them into, you're having more volume per session per muscles, but you're doing more muscle groups in a session. But the benefit to the split body is that you potentially get higher volumes. You can increase the volume of training because you can keep sessions shorter but train more frequently, and then have proper rest between those sessions. The benefit of a total body routine, you can get in more frequency per muscle per week with less total sessions per week. So they both have potential benefits. I carried out to test the theories. We know that 127 out of 127 bodybuilders train with a split routine. My job as a researcher is to test that theory, or basically the working hypothesis, if you will, that a split routine is superior to a total body routine. So what did I do? In order to optimize, to focus on what your target variable is, which in this case is frequency, all other aspects should be controlled. So I equated the volume between the groups. All we were looking at was frequency. One group did a total body routine, the other group did a split routine with volume equated, and everything else. The reps were equated, the rest intervals. Here's how it looked. So the split routine did like a leg day. So they had squats, leg press, and leg extension, 3 sets of each on Wednesdays. Whereas the total body routine, they did their squats on Mondays, their leg press on Wednesdays, and their leg extensions on Fridays. Everything was kept constant. So all we were looking at, is there a benefit to splitting the training frequency of body parts across either a total body routine or keeping them condensed via a split routine? What do you think we found? As opposed to what the bodybuilders are doing, we found a greater benefit to splitting up the frequency, to doing this total body routine instead of condensing everything into a split routine. Interesting, right? So we found if 127 out of 127 bodybuilders, can they all be wrong? Well, not necessarily. So again, what you have to remember, in order to isolate the variable of frequency, we had to keep everything else constant. One of the benefits, as I mentioned, of a split routine is that you can pack more volume in. The split routine technically could have done more volume because they could have trained Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday on this. I could have condensed it, and they could have trained more frequently per session per week. Whereas the total body routine, if you're doing your legs day 1, you're not going to do them generally again day 2, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. So it precludes you from adding more frequency of training. So that's a big confounder. And the other confounder here was that it's called the novelty factor. Virtually all the subjects that we had were doing a split routine coming into the study. These were trained subjects. So it then raises the question, if I were to take subjects who all had been doing a total body routine and put them on a split routine, could there be a benefit just by changing things around? We know that a novel stimulus helps to promote an adaptation, right? It helps to challenge a muscle in ways that it's not used to. That's something we don't know, and the problem is that when I say problem, in trying to get subjects that are all doing total body routines, we talked about how virtually all bodybuilders do splits. Well, how do most people train? They train the way their favorite bodybuilders do. So it's going to be very difficult to recruit enough subjects that are just doing a total body routine to test that hypothesis. We then sought to carry out a meta-analysis. And again, part of the problem with resistance training research is small sample sizes. So what we did was we took all the studies that had looked at greater frequencies versus lesser frequencies. We pooled those results. We found 10 total studies. 7 of them actually looked at muscle group frequency. The other 3 just looked at the frequency of the number of sessions. But we kind of focused in on these muscle group frequency, which again, to me, has greater relevance. How many times do you train in muscle group per week? What did we find? Well, again, there is a greater effect of more frequent sessions, or more frequent muscle group sessions, training a muscle more frequently. And again, and as you see here, the amount of gains was almost double in the higher frequency versus lower frequency. Basically, that is just looking at one group does higher, one group does lower, and what's going to produce greater benefits. A problem here was that we were not able to differentiate between, so we found that 2 was better than 1, 3 was better than 1. We couldn't differentiate whether 3 was better than 2, or 4 was better than 3, or 5 was better than 3. So we couldn't differ, there was not enough studies. It's, as you can see, really not, as I mentioned, only 7 total studies. So it's very difficult then to get any power, statistical power, to look at the higher frequency versus lower frequency. But here is, I mentioned about a forest plot. Every study showed a greater higher versus lower training frequency. So what does this tell us? Or what does this indicate, at least by my thought process? Well, probably a minimum of 2 times per week per muscle group is optimal. It could be more, possibly doing it more, but on a general basis, probably twice, training a muscle group twice per week has greater hypertrophic benefits than doing it just once per week. So the old total bro split, where you're just doing like chest one day, back another day, probably could be tweaked to get better results. How about rest intervals? Rest interval, as we know, is the time taken between sets. Right? How long do you rest between a set? The average bodybuilder, on average, bodybuilders train with short rest periods. And that dates back to the old theory that basically the hypertrophy theory was that 60 to 90 seconds optimize the hormonal spikes. So what we do know is that when you resistance train, immediately after the training session, you're going to get a spike in growth hormone, IGF-1, testosterone. Your anabolic hormones are going to spike for about an hour to 2 hours post-exercise. And it had been theorized for a long time that this post-exercise hormonal milieu, so the spike in these hormones, actually drove the hypertrophic response. The problem is that recent research shows that's not the case. Or it certainly cast doubt that that's the case, that there's really the effects of this post-exercise hormonal spike are minimal to almost potentially non-existent, but that any effects would be small. That is not what is really driving hypertrophy. And it really is more intrinsic, the things that are going on within the muscle cell itself, not the hormones that are traveling throughout the system. Importantly, though, that doesn't mean that hormones aren't important. Obviously, they are. So, but that's chronic hormones. So we know that if you take supplemental testosterone, that's going to boost muscle building. But that is not an acute response. That has nothing to do with what happens immediately after the workout. That's keeping the anabolic hormones high throughout the day and throughout your life. So we need then to take a step back and say, all right, if that's not driving growth, why might a shorter rest period be better than a longer rest period? Well, let's take a look at what the research says. There have been several studies. Oops. several studies that have been carried out. All of them have disparate results. So Atianen showed no differences. Burris showed greater increases for longer versus shorter, 2.5 minutes versus 1 minute. Villanueva showed greater increases for 1 minute versus 4 minutes. So it's all kind of all over the place here. And if you look at the studies themselves, they're carried out in all different populations. So Atianen was well-trained men. Villanueva was untrained elderly men. Burris was untrained younger men. When we try to then reconcile, how do we say, all right, well, which study are we going to go by? Well, a lot of that has to do with the population studied. If you're looking at older men, could this be maybe more something that would be considered to a greater extent? Those are things that are hard to know when we are only looking at one study. One of the things with research that we know is that one study is a piece in a puzzle. It is never a be-all, end-all. Each study builds on the next study, and we have to take each study in context, especially with application. If we're doing a validation study, yeah, that one study might have a lot more weight because we can control a lot of factors and we can validate and we can take a lot more credence in that validation. When we're doing an applied study, we're measuring muscle growth. There's all sorts of confounding issues, lifestyle factors, diet, which is hard to control in a free living population. We need a lot more studies to try to get a good sense of how people respond. So, the curious researcher that I am, I decided to carry out a study that really looked at the recommendations, which are 1 minute rest for hypertrophy, 3 minutes rest for strength. As you can see here, none of them really did that. This one came close. They looked at 2.5 versus 1. The problem with the Burris study was that the hypertrophy measurement was a skin fold. We know that has very limited accuracy and applicability to actual muscle growth. Skin fold measurements don't really tell you what the response is. So I looked at, basically, again, we're going to take a controlled group of subjects. One group had 1 minute rest, the other group had 3 minutes rest. Everything else was kept constant. So they trained 3 sets, 7 exercises, 8 weeks. What do we find? Again, interestingly, the longer rest period showed greater increases than the shorter rest period. That's contrary to what most guidelines have been up to this point. So what gives? Why might that be? Well, what we found here was that the shorter rest decreased volume load. As we talked about earlier, volume is a driver of hypertrophy, and volume load might even be more important, right? Well, what happens when you do one, let's say you're doing a set, a 10 RM, and then you have 1 minute rest. So let's say you did a set of curls with 100 pounds. And boom, that last rep, really hard to get up. You rest 1 minute. How much weight are you going to be able to use the next set? Are you going to be able to use that 100 pounds? No. You're going to have to reduce the amount of weight because your body has not recuperated sufficiently to maintain that load. Whereas if you took 3 minutes rest, you'd probably be able to continue using that 100 pounds. And that's what we found, that the drop-off in volume load was substantial. Can we derive cause and effect from that? No. Observational evidence does not, correlation is not necessarily causation. But it at least provides a hypothesis for why we might have seen this greater growth. Here's the kicker, though. We know this is the case with multiple multi-joint exercises, right? Like a bench press, a squat, a deadlift. You're going to see much greater fatigue responses when you're using shorter rest. When you're doing a single joint exercise, the amount of load that is decreased is much less. So if I were going to do a 10 RM in a biceps curl versus a 10 RM in a squat, my squat is going to go down a lot more with 1 minute rest versus the bicep curl. Could there then potentially be a benefit by taking longer rest in your compound exercises and shorter rest in your single joint exercises. That's, again, a working theory, something that I will look to test. But part of the problem when we're looking at most training studies is that we're looking at one condition versus another condition. We don't look at combinations. So most studies are not doing this, but you have to do the preliminary work first. You have to look at this and then start to develop this theory. Then we can start to say, all right, let's try to combine some of these. How might that work? So that's, hopefully you can see that research is such a complex phenomenon. Trying to draw real evidence-based conclusions is difficult. And that's why we have to use our personal expertise. We can use the research as a guideline, but then we have to draw upon our personal expertise in order to understand the application. Research can never tell you what to do. It only guides you. And also understand is that everyone responds differently. When we look at studies, we're getting the averages. Studies will provide the average response. But the average, we have one person that got hypertrophy here and another person that got hypertrophy here, they'll average out here. That doesn't mean that if I took this person and this person, I can give them the same routine and they'll see the same thing. I might have to tweak this person to get up here, right? That person might need a different stimulus. This is an interesting slide that kind of at least supports the potential for using shorter rest with a single joint versus longer rest for multi-joint. Look at what happened. This is 1 versus 3 minutes in the bench press. Look at the drop-off. So we see it from, here's 3 minutes rest, the first set to 5 sets, 10 reps in the first set. The fifth set, they're getting 6 reps. Here's 1 minute rest in the bench press, 10, they're getting 3 reps at the end. Now look at the 1 minute rest. They're starting out at 10 and getting 6. Here they're getting 4. So the gap has closed a lot with the 1 minute rest in the single joint. And that, again, might tell you, look at the gap here, how big that area under the curve is here versus here. So you're seeing much less reduction in volume load. Especially, by the way, in these first, let's say you're only doing 3 sets, really not much difference here in the single joint. You could see 6.7 versus 6.3 on the third set. So we do know that metabolic stress is a known driver of hypertrophy. And metabolic stress, for those who don't know, is the buildup of metabolites during training. We increase our production of hydrogen ions, lactate, which is lactic acid. Inorganic phosphate levels are increased. So these increases in metabolic stress have been shown to drive a hypertrophic response. Lactate there's emerging research that it's a signaling molecule and that there might be hypertrophic benefits to accumulating lactate from a hypertrophy standpoint. All really interesting, all speculative, but it's something to experiment with. Research comes from the field. So when you guys go out and you start experimenting with this and you come back and you say, you know what? I've been seeing great results from combining higher rest intervals, longer rest intervals with my multi-joint moves and shorter rest with my single joint moves. That's going to cause researchers to say, hey, that's something that needs to be studied. All right, we'll finish up the variable talk with tempo. It's also called cadence, how fast we're lifting, the speed that we're lifting with. So tempo is generally expressed as a 3-digit number. The first number is your concentric speed. The second number is the isometric portion when you reach the top of the move. And the third is the eccentric. So a 102 would be 1 second up, no seconds rest, and down. So basically it would be this. Let's say I wanted to do a 1-1-3, then I would go 1, I'd hold it for a second, and then I'd rest I'd lower it more slowly. So and the total rep duration would be found by adding these numbers. So in this case, the total duration of the rep is 3 seconds. If it was 2-1-3, that would be a 6-second rep. We carried out a meta-analysis, surprisingly. Basically, we've gotten now meta-analyses on most of these important variables. And we're continuing. I actually now have one that's in review on eccentric versus concentric actions that really has shown some interesting findings that we'll have results of, or hopefully have in publication within several months. But it's important, again, to pool the body of evidence to drive our future research. What we found in this meta-analysis, that anything from a 1 second up, 1 second down, to a 3 second up, 3 second down repetition, there were no differences in hypertrophy. Very similar outcomes. What does that tell you? Well, that lifting speed perhaps is not as important a variable as some of the other variables are. However, what we did find, and by the way, here's a kicker to that. The number of studies, there were 8 studies, but they had very different methodologies. So it's hard to pool these. This was the one meta-analysis I would say that I'm least confident in the results of. Because one study would look at 1 second duration versus 3 second duration. Another would look at 2 versus 4. Another would be 3 versus 7. And then trying to pool those to say, well, how are we going to now decide on this from a meta-analytic standpoint becomes difficult. And we need a lot more research in this area to have better clarity. I will say that I would not be surprised if we can hone these recommendations over time. We get more studies that have looked at this. But what about more than 6 seconds? What about if we're going to do a super slow rep? So for those who don't know, super slow, the general super slow protocol is a 10-second up, 10-second concentric, and a 5-second eccentric. So it's basically lifting very slowly. And the idea behind it, those who promote this style of training say that it reduces momentum, so it keeps more tension on the muscles. Is that true? Well, whether that's true or not really is not the issue. We can debate the biomechanics, but what's more relevant, does that really cause greater growth and greater strength? This was a really interesting acute study, an EMG study carried out by Keogh, and he looked at 5 seconds up, 5 seconds down, versus 1 second up, 1 second down. Now, of course, when you're lifting faster, you can use heavier weight. To intentionally slow down a lift requires that you're going to have to reduce the amount of weight that you're using, right? You can't take a very heavy load and try to lift it very slowly. What's going to happen? It's not going to move. You can't lift a heavier load slowly. It's physically impossible. It defies the laws of physics. Well, what did they find? They found that the concentric portion of the rep was 19% greater in the heavier load condition, in the activation, and the activation in the eccentric went up to 36% greater. So much greater activation, as you can see, in the faster condition. How does that translate into hypertrophy, though? That's the question. We know, again, that activation does not necessarily mean hypertrophy. Well, only one study to date has actually looked at that in a direct fashion. And they did find, indeed, that you got much greater hypertrophy with a traditional 1 second up, 1 second down, than with a 10-second up, 4 second down. So I will say it's one study. We need a lot more evidence, but the evidence to date certainly would not support using a very slow tempo, and probably suggests that it would be detrimental from a hypertrophic standpoint. Okay, so let's put all these together. We've talked a lot now about all these variables. How can we put these into practice? Because that's what everyone wants, right? They want to know, yeah, get those cameras out and snap this picture, because this really does summarize what we're looking for in terms of an evidence-based approach. Number one, we want to use higher volumes in general. Higher volumes, as we talked about, has a greater hypertrophic effect than lower volumes. Understand that each person, though, is going to, what higher versus lower means is subjective. It's specific to the individual. Some people might do better with 20 sets per week. Some people might do better with 15. Some people might do better with 12. Genetics are going to be factored in here. Frequency of feedings, the number of feedings, and how well nourished you are is going to have effect on this. Many factors, stress levels. We know that stress plays a big role in terms of response. So many factors are going to dictate what your optimal volume is. And as mentioned, it doesn't have to be, everyone wants one size fits all. They want, okay, tell me how many sets to do per week. I can't do that. No one can. I can give you guidelines, but again, you have to take these and customize them to the individual. And could it be that there's not necessarily doing 20 sets per week every week is beneficial? It might be that periodizing from 10 to 15 to 20, from 5 to 10 to 15, from 15 to 20 to 20, whatever that periodization is for that individual, it might be better that, again, going to the edge here, taking them to the cliff, and then pulling them back is the best way to go about it. Not necessarily keeping them at this one size fits all. Loading, as mentioned, you can get hypertrophy through a variety of loads. Heavy loads can produce hypertrophy. Moderate loads can produce hypertrophy. Higher reps can produce hypertrophy. Probably a benefit to combining them. I carried out a study not too long ago where we did a daily undulating approach. We did 3 repetitions on Monday, 10 repetitions on Wednesday, and 25 repetitions on Friday. And we compared that to 10 reps, 10 reps, 10 reps. And we did show, now it wasn't a huge difference, but we did show a trend towards greater growth, tendency towards greater growth with the DUP, with varying the loads. Could that have been through fiber type differences? Perhaps. We didn't do biopsies, so I can't tell you. But that does seem to be not only a viable approach, but perhaps a better approach to use a variety of loading strategies. Frequency. As mentioned, generally speaking, I'd recommend training each muscle twice per week. Now, could there be benefits to a true bro split where you're doing a 1 day per week muscle blitz? Well, you might be able to elicit more muscle damage, and that might help to drive greater growth. If you did that for short periods of time, the damage might be able to drive greater growth. Then you progress to doing a more frequent routine, and again, periodizing it. Periodization is really a wonderful strategy, and it frees you from thinking, all right, I just should be training the same way all the time. That it gives you this understanding that, especially when you get to more advanced levels, you need to train more strategically to continue growth. The body doesn't want to keep growing. That's inefficient from an evolutionary standpoint, right? Back in the prehistoric days, if you saw like some of the bodybuilders today, 300 pounds, try chasing down a wild boar when you're, a big bodybuilder, right? The body, it's not efficient to move in that respect. And not only that, you need a lot more food to maintain that muscle. So that would have been bad. They didn't have McDonald's back in prehistoric days, right? Mr. Paleo did not go to the store and say, hey, give me some bread and some sausage and I'm going to make a nice sandwich. He had to go hunt for his food. And there were times that it was difficult to get food. It's just not efficient for the body. So the body has been adapted to not growing bigger. We need to find strategies to optimize this. And that's why the periodization approach, where you're trying to look for ways to drive that growth, to keep the body off guard, if you will, to provide a novel training stimulus is important. So varying your frequency of training each muscle group can have advantages. I think in general, a 2-day per week per muscle group approach is better than one, and could more frequently be beneficial, perhaps. Rest interval, I would say that generally speaking, certainly for your compound multi-joint movements, 2 minutes or more rest is better than shorter rest to keep your volume load higher, but it could be better, or it could be optimal to include some shorter rest periods with your single joint movements. That might enhance the effect. And finally, tempo. We can achieve hypertrophy throughout a range of durations, anywhere between a 1 second up, 1 second down, a 3 second up, 3 second down. The one thing that I do at least hypothesize is important is to focus on the muscle, develop what we call a mind-muscle connection. So you can do that with 1 second or 3 seconds, but let's say when I'm doing a curl, I want to focus on that bicep working. I don't want to just get the weight up. That's good for strength, for maximizing strength, but for hypertrophy, focusing on the target muscle, certainly we know that it increases activation of the target muscle. Whether that translates into growth is still questionable. Fortunately, I do have a study that is now being carried out. We're actually completing the first phase of it, and I will have it finished by next semester, where we're controlling this. We are actually now looking, one group is just the cueing is get the weight up for the external focus and focus on the muscle. Squeeze the bicep, squeeze the quad for the internal focus, the mind muscle. And we're going to actually get to see now, this is the first longitudinal study that has looked at mind-muscle connection. And I'm really excited to see what those results will be. I have no clue how it's going to turn out. So a variety of tempos. And as mentioned, anything more than about a 3 second up, 3 second down certainly doesn't have benefit and could be detrimental. So I would advise not using certainly super slow techniques. I do want to thank Diamatized Nutrition for sponsoring my research. They have no restrictions. Basically, they give me money to carry out my studies. They say just mention us on the paper, say thanks to Diamatize, and I don't have to, I can publish what I want without them interfering. That's a really great benefit to have, and it allows me to carry out all this great research that I can give to you. Thank you again to NSCA Spain, and thank you guys. Hopefully you learned something.
Thank you. Thank you, Brad.
And I'm happy to take questions now, so please come up.
It's been amazing, your presentation. It's time to questions.
Thank you.
Dr. Schoenfeld?
To hear the
okay.
question.
Okay.
6 or 5, I'm not sure. Okay, you can change the channel here.
Okay.
Dr. Schoenfeld, thank you for your presentation and thank you for coming here to Spain to share your wisdom with us.
Gracias, my pleasure.
This is the best presentation I've ever heard in my life, and I got a couple interesting questions.
Sure.
My question is, what is your opinion on the strength and hypertrophy relationship? Do you believe an individual has to maximize their strength in order to reach their physiological hypertrophy limit, if there is even such a thing?
Yeah, that is a great question, and the answer is yes. There is certainly a direct relationship between hypertrophy and strength. It is not a linear relationship, meaning that just because you necessarily increase growth, you're not going to see the same increase in strength. A majority of strength increases are due to neural factors, But as you start getting stronger and stronger, the amount of neural increases you can get diminishes. So it really starts to, in my opinion, and there's very limited, interestingly, very limited research on this, but as you start to get higher and higher with your training, hypertrophy would at least hypothetically become more important to drive the strength increase, because you're not going to see additional increases in neural efficiency. When you keep going, you're training, your neural effects start to tap out, and thus the greater effects of more lean body mass will have greater effects on strength.
So you believe purely neuromuscular strength training will have carryover effects to hypertrophy?
Well, no. Okay, so that's different. So saying that will strength then increase, hypertrophy will necessarily increase strength. Will strength necessarily increase hypertrophy? Not necessarily. I do think there's a relationship there too. The backwards relationship is that when you increase strength, it's going to help you to train more. When you start to use more moderate loads, you'll be able to use heavier loads and thus get greater mechanical tension. What we do know is that higher volumes of training, as I mentioned, drive hypertrophy. If you're just doing a lot of neuromuscular strength training, you can't do high volumes. So if I'm doing 3 reps, I carried out a study. This is a really interesting phenomenon and I think is very important to understand. So we showed, this was actually my dissertation work, showed that a 3-day a week routine using 3 sets of 10 had equal hypertrophy to 7 sets of 3. So we used, basically it was a powerlifting routine versus a bodybuilding routine. They showed no differences in hypertrophy. But again, we had to do almost more than double the amount of work to equal the volume in the powerlifting group. We had to do 7 sets of 3 to equate the volume. This is volume equated. Well, that's fine. So we had no differences in hypertrophy. It shows that you can get big doing a neuromuscular powerlifting routine. What's the problem? Well, the problem is that at the end of this 8-week study, every one of the people in this powerlifting group were toast. They were complaining of sore joints, back pain, knee pain. I mean, they wanted time off. They were at the beginning of being overtrained. And it just shows that if you keep training very, very heavy all the time with high volumes, it's going to have a negative effect. You can train heavy, you have to moderate your volumes. You can't do the highest volumes which are required for hypertrophy.
Okay, my last question is regarding fiber type and hypertrophy. Mm-hmm. You have shown very interestingly that different people respond differently to different loads. We might hypothesize that might be because we have a general fiber type composition. So to quote the general example, we are some more endurance guys and sprinters guys. So could you say it makes sense to prioritize a certain rep range in order to maximize hypertrophy?
Okay, so so I would say that at least hypothetically, you could say, well, train to your fiber type, meaning that if you're more type 1 dominant, you might respond better to higher reps. And if you're more type 2 dominant, you might respond better to heavier loads. The problem with that is that, number one, generally in the majority of the population, the range of fiber type differences between individuals isn't all that much. So it might range, let's say your quads, one person might be 60-40, type 2 to type 1, the other person might be 40 to 60. That's not a huge difference. If you were 80-20, that would be a big difference. And there were some of those. I mean, they've shown like some of the Kenyan distance runners are 80% slow twitch, and some of the real sprinters are 70% fast twitch. Then you're getting to a point where that might have greater applicability. But most people, I don't think that's going to matter all that much because of their fiber typing. The other problem is, how do you determine your fiber type? Unless you're going to do a biopsy, you don't know. So it's just not a practical means for training. So we can talk about hypotheses, and maybe in the future you'll be able to do a blood test or something, or you put a saliva test and say, hey, what's your fiber typing? We're a long ways away from being able to do that.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Hello, Brad. It's an honor to have you here.
My pleasure.
Thank you. So my first question is, in the studies you do and in the meta-analysis you do with other guys, with other colleagues. Do you always do it like to failure, or because you have to equalize everything?
Yeah, so the answer to that is yes. The problem with not training to failure is that you lose control. So if I say, all right, we're going to stop short of failure in one group and not the other group, well, that really confounds the study. And if both groups stop short of failure, how do we know where they're stopping short? Like, at what point do you stop short of failure? Is it 1 rep? Is it 2 reps? How do we know they were only 1 rep from failure? How do we know there were 2 reps? So you can start to get technical, and there are now certain scales that have been promoted. A colleague of mine, Eric Helms, has looked at what's called repetitions in reserve, but there's still variation in terms of how people perceive their time from being in failure, and you have to acclimate them to it. It becomes a very messy scenario, and what we found is that it's best, especially in these short-term studies, to go to failure. Usually they're not going to be overtrained by, if that does take place in the short time course of the study, and it allows better control of the study.
Okay. And second, more as a personal training that you've been, do you usually use relative lows as, for example, Billepin's chart, or do you use time under tension, or?
Yeah, I generally look at repetition ranges. So my approach, as we talked about earlier, is to go in what we call loading zones. So let's say 1 to 5, a heavy loading zone, 1 to 5 reps, a moderate loading zone, 6 to 12 reps, a light loading zone, 15 plus reps, 15 to 25 reps. I think, again, it targets the individual more specifically. Time under tension is less important to me in terms of the time under tension per set. Because as I mentioned earlier, before, when you're doing a 3 rep with 7 sets, your total time under tension for that exercise, you can't just look at what you're doing in that set, the 3 reps. You have to look at it across the number of sets. And we showed that there was no difference between 3 reps versus 10 reps, provided volume load was equated. So the time under tension factor, the fact that the 10 rep group had 3 times or more greater time under tension, didn't translate into greater hypertrophy. It was total volume load. And that's why the repetition range really, to me at least, allows a more focus on potential effects of fiber type, of getting type 1 versus type 2. So we're looking at light loads versus heavy loads, and it's a better quantification in my opinion.
Thank you very much.
You're quite welcome.
Thank you, Brad, for your excellent presentation and for come here in Spain.
Thank you for having me, Pedro.
Voy a hacer las preguntas en castellano, sobre todo por enterarme yo de lo que quiero preguntar.
No entiendo.
I'm going to make my questions in English. So first of all, I'd like to thank you and from the community of personal trainers, because to turn into science what's something we think at the facilities, the work that you do to test all the hypotheses is amazing, and that makes work more solid. So thank you very much to bring all the work to science, all that empiric knowledge. Thank you very much, Brad. That's on the one hand. So throughout your presentation, you have talked about one of the factors that lead to muscle growth, which is training. And we call it the triangle of success when combining factors that lead to hypertrophy. And training is very important, but we mustn't forget nutrition and the rest period. And we mustn't forget genetic individual components. What do you believe about all this triangle, about these conditions that can maximize the hypertrophic gain?
Yeah, that's a terrific question. And the short answer is that they are all extremely important. So training, as you mentioned, is one component. It is certainly going to be based on genetics, and unfortunately you can't pick your parents. So you are what you are, but everyone, the good news is that everyone can maximize their own hypertrophic response. And that's what you have to deal with the cards you're dealt with. But everyone can see, very good gains if they take the proper approach. But that does require attention to nutrition. I was just talking last night over dinner, we were talking about how important the nutritional response is. From a sports nutrition, to me, it really is married to exercise science, and that if you're not particularly taking in enough protein, we actually have a meta-analysis. I'm collaborating with the lab of Stu Phillips, who many of you might know. We just carried out a meta-analysis on protein supplementation, and part of that again showed that if you're not getting 1.6 grams per kilogram per day of protein, you're not maximizing your hypertrophic response. And of course, just the caloric energy intake. If you are not in an energy surplus, if you're trying to diet and gain maximal muscle, it's not going to happen. Energy itself is a driver of the hypertrophic response. So you might be able, especially at the beginning, to lose some body fat and gain some muscle. You're not going to maximize that response. And as you get leaner and as you get more well-trained, it becomes more and more imperative that you're going to have a caloric surplus to we call it a bulk phase. And it doesn't mean bulking, you have to look like a sumo wrestler when you finish. But you do need to be in a surplus and ultimately gain some body fat to maximize that muscle. So yeah, and other things like getting enough sleep, reducing stress in your life, these are factors that also can have negative effects on hypertrophy. And by the way, which are confounding issues that we can't deal with in research. So we're carrying out, that's again a thing with these small studies, these small sample size studies, is that when these are free living humans, when they go home, we ask them to write down what they eat. Does that mean they're actually writing down what they're eating? If I look at some of these food diaries, I'm saying there's no way that they're really eating the way they're telling me. I get a 220-pound guy telling me he's having 1,300 calories a day and he's gaining muscle. I'm like, come on now. So all of these things very important. And yeah, having any bodybuilder will tell you that these are factors that if they're not paying attention to them, they're not optimizing their muscle development.
Bueno, finalmente la última pregunta.
Thank you. Thanks to Star Wars and their good relationship with health and strength. Strength is gaining a lot of people and is in fashion. And one of the questions that my students make is that whether we'll be able to predict the muscle growth in the relation with energy balance. Do you believe of an equation that takes into account age, the condition, the experience could be a good predictor of a strength predictor? Can we predict how much in kilocalories it costs to win 1 gram of muscle?
Yeah, that's really the unfortunate answer is no. We can estimate roughly how many calories you're going to need to to put yourself in a position to maximize gains in strength and muscle. But the current formulas that we have are really just gross estimates. They need to be tweaked. So I can give you formulas and say, all right, here's a formula, but now we have to say, all right, let's see how you do on this, because there's no way you can individualize that. And even when you do things like, you can help to make it better by doing metabolic testing. If you have let's say a hood where you're putting them in collecting gases, it's obviously, if you're not a university, it's going to be very difficult to do that. But even if you can, it still only gives you baselines by which to go by, and they always need to be tweaked. So basically, I would say that we can get you into a ballpark, and then within several weeks, you need to monitor how you're doing. And any athlete that I've worked with, or figure competitor, a bodybuilder, within, I would say, 3 to 4 weeks, we're always able to really dial in and nail how many calories they need.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
Thanks so much for your presentation. I would like you to ask you about the relationship between strength and hypertrophy. Mm-hmm. So when we perform training studies, we always find high responders in hypertrophy. And I would like to ask you whether you find a relationship between being a high responder in hypertrophy and also a high responder in strength.
It's a great question. I have never looked at that correlation. So we have never done correlation studies. That's something actually I could do. I can actually go, I could take, we have a lot of data.
Welcome.
So I could go back and maybe I'll be here next year and I can give you some data on that. I have not looked at that and I've not recalled seeing any other groups. So you've given me actually a good idea for a new study. Look at that.
I revised.
That's the beauty of coming to these places, right? I get more studies just by your recommendations. So
Yeah, I revised.
do I have to give you credit when I do that? You'll email me and
Enough data.
I'll put you on the study.
Yeah, you have to join us. So I have another one. It's about one of your studies, the one you published in the European Journal of Applied Physiology in 2014, about the EMG activity. So you tested, if I remember well, you did an analysis EMG in the frequency domain, the difference between high and low intensity. You remember? Yeah. So what do you think it will happen with your data in the frequency domain, with the differences between?
I don't know what you mean frequency domain. What's
frequency domain is fast Fourier. No. Yeah, when you test the frequency, when you analyze, for example, intensity, EMG intensity, you are working in the time domain. And when you go for the frequencies for the frequency components of the EMG signal, you are testing this in the frequency domain. And this can give you information about the fiber types that were working.
You mean okay, because there's no way I know through SEMG we do what's called surface electromyography where you're putting electrodes. I've not seen any ability to look at fiber. Basically, you're going to need to do superimposed burst. Are you talking about like the superimposed burst technique, or?
Well,
I've not seen any way where we can localize the actual motor units that are being done through SEMG, but maybe.
From what I saw there, I think you were using an Oraxon.
Oraxon, correct.
Device, and you can choose to analyze there. If you have the raw data, you can do that.
Okay. I mean, I can talk to you. I'm not aware through Naraxon that I'm able to do that, but that's interesting. But yeah, I have the data, so maybe I can talk to you on break and you can give me some insight.
Thanks so much.
You're welcome. Hola.
Hola, how are you?
I'm good. Bueno.
Muy bien.
Thank you very much, Brad, for your presentation. I have a million questions, and but I would like to comment on something which I believe is important. There are so many factors, so many confounding factors, that it's very difficult to perform an analysis. So, at the beginning of your presentation, you talked about volume, and you have given us two ways of considering volume: sets and the reps, and then and the other one, which is in my opinion more appropriate, sets, reps, and load. Is that right? So on the one, we will talk about the work performed, which is important to determine the main stimulus for the training, right? You got the message? Yep. Okay. So
In the
what I didn't see in the meta-analysis is when you talked about volume, for example, where you're considering the first approach or the second approach. And I think it's very important to consider this, especially because meta-analysis, one of the critiques that they have from a scientific point of view, is that generally journals where we do meta-analysis, and they collect data that have been significant due to improvements. So the first question, whether you in those meta-analysis you have considered the first approach, sets plus reps, or the second approach, sets, reps, and loads. And then the second question.
Hold on, let me answer the first one before we get to the second one, because I'll forget by the time we're in the second one, I'll forget the first one. That's a really good question, important. So in the meta-analysis, we look to control all the variables. So the short answer is that while we're just looking at sets per week, which is basically the first approach, the second approach follows along because they all did the same number of sets, the same number of repetitions. So the volume load would have to be, now it's not going to be quite a linear approach because depending on the repetition range, the number of reps will go down slightly with each number of sets. But let's say they did 10 sets, let's say they did one set of 10 versus 3 sets of 10 with 100 pounds. They're all using sets of 10 reps. So if maybe they're on set 2, they went down to 95 pounds, and then set 3, they went down to 92 pounds. It's going to be roughly the same volume load. The volume load would be within the same rough range because they're doing, the number of reps was consistent. And if the number of reps was consistent, then we didn't look at 3 sets of 3 versus 6 sets of 10. That would then not, hopefully everyone gets that, is that if you're keeping the number of repetitions the same across volumes, the volume load has to be within a fairly rough estimate of being the same. If anything, it would not favor the higher volume, and that would actually give a stronger indication that volume is an even greater effect because the volume load might have been slightly down in the higher volume condition. So hopefully that comes across, but that would not, in my opinion, be a criticism of the meta-analysis because as long as everything else, we just looked at differences in volume, so in number of sets, and if everything else is controlled, the volume load has to be roughly in that range. So second question.
Thank you. And la segunda.
And the second question, your opinion, I would like to know. This is so complicated and there's so many variables, and in the analysis we are considering weekly frequency, for example, but wouldn't it be convenient I would like to know your opinion, to use a parameter that would encompass all of them, like the workload, the amount of work, and the power, i.e. to include the rest time between sets? What do you think of having this parameter that encompasses them all?
I think it's good in theory. I think it's very difficult to pull off, though, because you start to then look at, number one, what's going on at the cellular level. We don't know fiber type, how the fiber type responds. So you're just saying if I come up with a parameter that will somehow look at total work done within the week. Again, the issue is that it doesn't tell you how that was dispersed, and it would then, for me at least, be hard to tease out the other effects. Now, maybe I'm open to it. I think that's an interesting hypothesis, but because we might find one parameter, does that mean that if we change that parameter around with other, you'd have to investigate it in so many different permutations. I'm not sure how that translates into Spanish, but 3 sets of 7 3 times a week versus 10 sets of 2 4 times a week. There's so many different ways you can do it that you'd have to keep investigating that parameter over so many different permutations. It would be hard then to come up with we can look at it once and say, hey, that fit in with that parameter in one, but it doesn't mean that it would if you looked at it differently. So I think that is an interesting thing, because here's the one thing that I think is real important that you're pointing out, is there's an interaction amongst these variables, and that when we study them, we look to control everything to try to isolate the variable, but then that doesn't account, and hopefully I've pointed that out, for the interactions between variables. And that is a thing that is so hard to understand, and that's why research can guide us. I'm open towards that type of parameter, but if you can come up with one, you talk to me and we'll look to research it.
Thank you very much. I'll try to get the variable.
Okay, gracias.
It's a great pleasure to listen to you. We look for pure hypertrophy. You said that lower reps, moderate or high reps, when there's a stimulus, there's hypertrophy. Would it be coherent to say or in that same session or workout, that 10 sets or 20 sets, and to split them, to have one sets to 4, one sets to 8, and another sets to 15 reps, in order to stimulate all sorts of fibers. We think it's convenient to split it?
So it's a great question, and the way the practical application, so the short answer is I think it is beneficial, as I mentioned, to train across a spectrum of loading ranges, that not focusing on a particular, or you don't need to, and I think there's a benefit to potentially training heavy, moderate, and light over some time. You could do that within the same session. You could do that on a daily undulating, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, as I mentioned. You could do that in a more block linear. So 1 month you do a mesocycle of endurance. The next you do a mesocycle of hypertrophy, then a mesocycle of strength. These are where your expertise comes in, and that, again, research can guide us. It's not going to tell you that one is necessarily better than another. Something that I've experimented with is doing your heavier work with your multi-joint exercises and your lighter work with your single joint exercises. So let's say for squats, you might do, again, based on exercise, for your squat in a given workout, you might do 4 sets of 3 to 5. Then you'll do, let's say, a lunge for 4 sets of 6 to 12. And then you do a leg extension, 4 sets of 15 to 20. So it might be chosen by the exercise itself. So many ways to go about this that I can only give you examples and give you kind of my own interpretation. Like that is at least theoretically kind of a cool way to go about it, but there's no right or wrong way, and they all potentially can have similar effects.
Then you talked about that it's for hypertrophy is to train twice the same group. So when you do chest or quads very intense, something that you do 20 or 25. What about doing 15 and 15? The chest is recovered, and then the next you can train more. What do you think?
15 and 15. What is 15 and 15?
If a guy can do 30 sets to maximize hypertrophy, is to divide it into 15 or 15 sets, right? The chest, you think, can be recovered if you go to maximum intensity and 15, so that the next, and you do it another time?
Number one is going to depend upon how much rest you're going to have between the muscle group. If you're going to have 72 hours rest, yes, I think that you're going to be fully recovered for your next chest workout. But that brings up an important point, which I didn't have time to get into, was about training to failure and how often you should train to failure. I don't feel, now if you train to failure on all of those 15 sets, that's going to have greater effects on your recovery than if you only train to failure on 4 of those sets. And I do think that managing the failure aspect is a very important point here. And bottom line, without getting into, we don't have time to get into all the research, but that minimizing the amount of training to failure, I think that most sets should be stopped 1 to 2 reps short of failure, and that you should then only look to really push on your last set or within a couple of sets of that particular exercise. That will allow you to recuperate better and thus come back.
Hello, good morning. It is a great pleasure to ask this personally, by the way. So, in the last picture where you had the summary and all the pillars that you've talked about and variables, would you change anything if we talked about women? If we applied it only to women, would you change anything in that final slide?
So, first of all, it's nice that a woman actually gets to ask a question here, because I was bombarded with men. But that is a topic. So I actually owned a facility where we trained almost exclusively women for very long periods of time. And so training women, I was again talking last night, I enjoy training women more than I enjoy training guys, because women are more in tune with their bodies. Guys tend to have more of that macho attitude, and they want to push, they're going for the 1 rep max, where women are more prone towards listening and to being open. The problem when training women for hypertrophy is that most women are so fearful of getting huge from lifting heavy that they're going to basically they run to the pink dumbbells. And that's been a passion of mine to really educate that women will not get huge and bulky from training. They will look, like you. The question then comes how to maximize for those women who want to maximize hypertrophy, and there really is not much difference in terms of the approach that I use. With women, it more has to do with the psychology of making them aware that it's going to be extremely difficult for them to get as big or to get anything close to a lot of hypertrophy because their chronic hormonal levels are suppressed. Men have 10 or more times the amount of circulating testosterone as women, and chronic testosterone production is a major driver of the hypertrophic response. The one thing I will say is that where this somewhat gets a little murky is that there is some evidence that women have greater endurance capacity so that they can push more in terms of recuperation. That is an individual, I think on a general level that might be the case, but that comes down to individual experimentation. And the other issue is that, and this has more to do with, again, the individual and more time specific, is training women around their menstrual period, where women often their ability to train can be altered depending on the woman. But again, that is not specific to any of the variables. That comes down to just managing that particular person, knowing their response, and a lot of times you will try to have your deload periods around there because the women are not in a mental state, an emotional state to train as hard.
Okay, thank you.
Gracias.
Última pregunta.
So last question. So first of all, thank you very much, Brad. And these sort of presentations give sense to what we do, to our work, and we have invested many hours, and we've talked about different variables and to improve hypertrophy. But I would like to ask you how to maintain that hypertrophy. We train people, we get that hypertrophy, but that hypertrophy, how long it will maintain in time? In August, people go out for holidays and go to the beach, and we know all this. So I would like to know your opinion on how do you see the approach of week 1, microcycle, a chest gain, and then the next week do maintenance of that gain, and I increase the hypertrophy of the lower limbs, for example.
Here's the good news, is that once you gain muscle, it's relatively easy to keep it. Now, it depends on how much you gain. When you start getting into bodybuilding territory, very large increases, it can be somewhat harder. You might need more maintenance, but minimal volumes can provide a maintenance of hypertrophy once you've achieved it. So 1 to 2 times a week is all you might need to train, depending on the person, to keep a certain level of hypertrophy, or certainly to not lose substantial amounts of mass, and you can regain them quicker. Even complete absence of training, depending upon how long you've trained, you can go 2 weeks and not see any muscle mass loss. You will see more strength. Strength will decline more quickly than hypertrophy. So you'll see strength might last a week, and then you'll start to see hypertrophy a couple weeks before it starts to decline. The other really good news is that we have what are called satellite cells. Satellite cells are precursor cells. They donate their nuclei to muscle fibers to promote more protein synthesis. The body makes more satellite cells as you start training. Those satellite cells are maintained over long periods of time, up to 2 years or more in humans. And that means that even if you were to stop training completely and you lost hypertrophy, you gain it back. That's kind of the muscle memory factor that's often talked about, where you will gain back the muscle much more quickly because of this increased ability to synthesize contractile proteins. So bottom line from your people who go away on holiday, if they can commit 1 day a week even to training, they will see attenuation, almost no loss of muscle mass over that fairly short period of time. Now, if you keep doing that over very long periods, you probably are going to start to see somewhat more of a decline, but certainly over a month, a couple months, just training 1 day a week has been shown fairly conclusively to maintain a given level of mass.
Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Brad.
To ask you the last question.
Yeah.
All of us know that genetics is really important in muscle growth. And some years ago, science paid attention to myostatin, for example. And nowadays it seems that stem cells, in Spanish, célula satélite, is a key point. So my question is, which is, in your opinion, the next future of research on muscle growth from a biological point of view? So which are the challenges, the future challenges on this field? Thank you.
Yeah, so I think that really from a biological standpoint, a physiological standpoint, the most interesting to me are what are called myokines. So muscles themselves secrete substances. And these substances not only are intrinsic within the muscle, but they also can affect other tissues. From a growth perspective, we still don't have a really great handle on how these substances interact. So to give you, for instance, some of them are immune cells. So like interleukins, IL-6, IL-12, IL-15, interleukin 12, interleukin 15. We know that they do promote, they have effects on protein synthesis and other factors. We're not sure how they interact, the interaction between them with, let's say, myostatin, which is, in my opinion, at least at this point, it seems to be somewhat of an overhyped myokine. That's one of the myokines. In terms of its negative effect, we know that if you can block out myostatin, that you can have a lot of growth. But in most humans, it doesn't seem to have huge effects, at least in most stages. It might, when you start getting towards the very high levels of hypertrophy, start to block you from continuing to grow. We're not really sure about that. But again, that's where really we need so much more information. So as I mentioned at the beginning of this, and this is, I think, a good way to leave off, is that we know so much more than we have just 5 years ago. I started my dissertation now 7 years ago. When I was starting my dissertation, we've come so far. If I envision some of the stuff we knew now, it's really amazing to think how far we've come. But we have so much further to go. We are still in the infancy of research, particularly on hypertrophy. We've had, up until, again, fairly recently, strength had been the primary focus of most strength and conditioning researchers. Hypertrophy was kind of the bastard child of the strength and conditioning community, where bodybuilding wasn't something that really strength people cared about. The only reason they cared about hypertrophy was a potential link to strength, as we've talked about. But when I was a trainer, 90% of the people that came to me, what was their goal? They want to look great naked. They want to get more muscle. They want to have less body fat. They didn't care about jumping higher or running faster. Obviously, that's an important consideration with athletes, essential. But for the vast majority of the population, it's hypertrophy for aesthetic sake. And we're now getting a lot of this research. Again, certainly that's a focus of my research, and I know some others have also done some really great work in the area. We're going to see over the next, I'm sure, 5 years, huge improvements, but there's so much more to know, and I would say 25, 50 years down the road, it's going to be really great to have so much more of an understanding as technology gets better, as our ability to research these things improves, and as just the number of studies keeps growing, as we're going to get more researchers interested. Hopefully, and one of my passions is to inspire future researchers to come into the field and to start carrying out more of this research. We need more people doing this. I'm one researcher, and I try to churn out, and I collaborate with a lot of people, other labs. Anyone wants to collaborate, I'm always game for that. But we need these studies to be carried out, and the more I can hopefully influence that, the more the field will grow and the more we'll have a greater understanding. So again, I can't thank you enough for coming, and I hope you've learned something, and I'll be around, so stop by. Thank you.